John Handel is a historian of modern Europe in general and modern Britain in particular. He focuses on the history of finance during the 19th century, and his dissertation explores the social, infrastructural, and epistemological underpinnings that helped create the first modern financial markets. John is going to present today the paper, The Politics of Arbitrage, Connecting and Disconnecting Global Markets, 1870 to 1920. So John, it's a pleasure to have you here. To all that are participating in this webinar today, John's gonna present for about 15-20 minutes, and then we're gonna open the floor for questions. You can also, either use the raise your hand option or place your questions in the chat, and I'm gonna read it to John. Thank you, John. So the floor is yours.
Thanks, Paula, and thanks to everyone who came and to all the organizers. This has been a really terrific seminar series. It's been such a terrific mix of people who do more quantitative and economic history and people who are more on the social and cultural history side. It's been a really terrific dialogue over the course of this pandemic-inflected year. And it's very nice to see so many people in the chat and on the Zoom too. So hello to everyone. Basically, this presentation is going to be a very quick rundown of the paper itself, if you didn't get to read it. I'm just going to hit some of the main bullet points, and I'm happy to go more in depth on any of it during the Q&A. So this project emerged out of my broader dissertation project, which looks at the creation of modern financial markets in the 19th century. The 19th century is when stock exchanges are built all around the world. They're enclosed in purpose-built buildings. They're connected via telecommunications. Share certificates are standardized. Companies are traded on similar stock exchanges throughout the world. And a professionalized labor force, a large professionalized labor force is created to manage these markets. And arbitrage was a way of actually seeing how all of these different new infrastructures of financial markets came to bear on this, what is considered by a lot of people to be, in some ways, the fundamental mechanism of modern financial markets that keep them in equilibrium and balance. So my project, or this paper, kicks off from wondering, what if we think about arbitrage from the ground up as it works in practice, rather than thinking about arbitrage as something that is always a product of efficient markets in theory. And broadly speaking, I think economic history has gotten better at doing this, but especially in the history of arbitrage, we still tend to project theoretical ideas of arbitrage onto the past. So there's a sampling of historiography that does this, but I think my issue with some of these approaches is that they work in very abstract terms. So they'll look at some event study like the introduction of the transatlantic telegraph, and they'll measure the effectiveness of arbitrage by looking at the closing price signals of a particular security. And they'll juxtapose that against the new volume of telegraph messages that's traded. And they'll say that, oh, after the introduction of this telegraph, we see that the prices in these two different markets where a similar security is traded are closer than they used to be before the telegraph. Hence, arbitrage and technology help usher in something like efficient and integrated markets over the course of the late 19th century, from the 1860s, give or take, until the First World War. I have a lot of issues with this, which will come up. The first being that the price signals from newspapers are really not a great way of actually getting into what's happening in arbitrage. There is one source I have who refers to the prices that are reported every day as just a record of bad bargains. And then the second one is that these telegraphic systems and technological systems that underpin arbitrage trading are really unequally distributed. So what if we begin to view infrastructure and technology not as these universal enablers of financial markets, but think about the ways that they actually restrict behavior, economic decision-making in certain ways? I also try and open up this is very telling for the current week that we've been in with the Biden administration, but what a more capacious view of infrastructure that looks at the broader systems that enable financial markets to work. This is their laborers like porters and messenger boys up to the actual production of pricing information. And what we see is that the ability of arbitrageurs to actually integrate these markets is limited and shaped by the different constraints that infrastructure imposes on it. And then I'm going to talk about 4 at the end of the presentation. So just a few examples briefly. So technology. When the London Stock Exchange first tries to open up direct bourse-to-bourse, stock exchange to stock exchange communication with Paris in the 1880s and 90s, they actually quite quickly figure out that the system of telegraphic delivery of messages in Paris is so radically different from theirs in London that it would be basically an administrative impossibility to do this. Because all the Paris messages get lumped in with the national post office or the national telegraph service in Paris, so it's hard to separate them out. So this is one way it was very difficult to actually sort of enforce efficient technological standards across a distributed system. In 1911 to 1912, when the London Stock Exchange tried to do this again, they managed to actually get some sign-on from telegraphic companies and the General Post Office in Britain, but the telegraphic capabilities are still widely distributed very unequally. That is to say, larger exchanges like Paris and Berlin get much better telegraphic service than, say, Amsterdam or Brussels, which are still limited. And then the third part of this is that new technological changes in one part of the network typically expound and create different political blowback throughout the rest. So when London was pushing for the bourse-to-bourse connections in between the 1890s and 1910s, other stock exchanges in Britain began lobbying and politically attacking London for the ways that it was beginning to monopolize technological infrastructure. So Liverpool was at a big disadvantage. One of my favorite examples is that for Liverpool, the direct lines that they had to the European continent were simplex telegraph systems. You could only send one message in one direction across the wire at a time, whereas London was equipped with multiplex systems where you could send two or more messages in different directions at the same time. So when Liverpool arbitrageurs were trying to work in Europe, European financiers could simply clog up the lines by sending nonsense messages towards Liverpool, and Liverpool arbitrageurs couldn't get through to the continent. So they end up sending their telegraphic messages to New York, which then gets them shuttled into Europe. And so they're extremely upset about this, and they are constantly lobbying and attacking the London Stock Exchange and the General Post Office system in Britain. And then by the 1920s, when a bourse-to-bourse system is instantiated, it's still unequally distributed. It's only available for a couple of hours during the day. And once again, Paris gets a much better service than, say, Amsterdam or Brussels, which are put on extremely limited simplex wires like Liverpool was using. And Germany doesn't get any connection at all because of the results of World War I. Labor is the other thing that I want to bring into the fold here. Different financial centers had very different systems of how they delivered messages and produced information. In Britain, the telegraph boy is a huge trope and a huge presence in financial markets. But British arbitrageurs are constantly complaining about the fact that in France, they use pensioners and women to deliver messages which they consider to be slower and a worse and less efficient service. Clerks are also the other extremely important part of this. They are, in order to conduct arbitrage in the late 19th century, you need to be able to speak with people in other countries. So foreign language ability is deeply important. And you also have to be very mathematically adept. You have to do currency conversions on the fly. You have to calculate the cost of cables as you're trying to think about whether an arbitrage transaction is profitable or not. And so there develops a really a large market in London for highly skilled foreign clerks, which creates status panic among English clerks who think they're being pushed away by the fact that firms are hiring huge amounts of German and Dutch and Swiss clerks. And there are certain firms who simply can't compete because they can't pay these clerks enough to come work for them. And then the third one is that in the 19th century, you can't just do arbitrage simply by clicking on your computer screen. You actually have to find a foreign partner in one of these cities. And sometimes they're very difficult to find someone you trust. There was one arbitrage partner I found who was actually the partner of multiple different firms in Britain and would simply play their orders off against one another instead of actually conducting arbitrage on the lines that he had agreed with on each of the individual firms. Eventually they find this out, but it's one of these things where it's very difficult to ascertain these things at a distance in the 19th century. So rather than being abstract preconditions of arbitrage, these shaped the everyday practice of it. So for one, because telegraphy was expensive, especially transatlantic telegraphy or telegraphy between Britain and Europe, arbitrage firms used code words extensively. And when you use code words to conduct your financial transactions, you need staff who are adept at quickly decoding messages. So they developed a special decoding staff. In particular, this is a problem for transatlantic arbitrage because the location of the telegraph offices were not in the London Stock Exchange. The Western Union that did a lot of the transatlantic work, they didn't have an office in the London Stock Exchange. And so firms, again, needed messenger boys and decoding facilities to do these messages, which they didn't have. So just to show you, you can't see it, but the Western Union office was over here. The American market in the London Stock Exchange was over here, whereas the normal telegraph offices for everything else are right here and right here. And so these offices had space within them for decoding. They were right off the floor of the exchange. It was very easy to do this if you were operating, say, European arbitrage out of here or arbitrage of the provinces in Britain here. But if you were doing American arbitrage, you had to work with Western Union over here. You had to run your messenger boys all the way in here, and then you needed some space on the floor to decode messages, which there wasn't. And then I'm going to go through briefly one example of how this plays out and how it's difficult to assume, I think, that arbitrage is sort of simply and easily created equilibrium in these markets. So in August 22, 1911, there was a London firm and a New York firm that were arbitrage partners began their business in Canadian Pacific Railway shares. In New York, they opened at 234 pounds, give or take. In London, it's 240 pounds a share. So the New York firm is instructed to buy up, hoping to push the price up, while the London firm tries to sell down to 240. A little bit after that, it turns out that the price in New York, despite the arbitrage firm purchasing more shares, continues to drop. It turns out there are more shares that are being sold in Berlin, which is causing a big sell-off across the European markets that is moving into America. The New York firm is able to tell this to the London firm, but the London firm hesitates, doesn't sell off their position yet, and holds, but only begins to sell it off once the price dips below 238 pounds a share. By 4 p.m., the price is rallied to close at over 239 pounds a share in London, and the arbitrage opportunity here is just really, it's been bungled because they didn't know which way the price was going. They were trying to chase momentum in market trends and not actually perform some sort of concise arbitrage between the price of these two securities. And it's complicated by the fact that there's orders coming in from places that are not New York and London. So the New York partner eventually writes to the London partner in anger about this. Do you call this arbitrage? And it creates, there's a lot of friction between these two firms. And by September of that year, just a month later, they end up shutting down their arbitrage business together. There's a few reasons for this, and it comes back to these broader problems of infrastructure. One, the New York firm only has one clerk that is able to do arbitrage, and he's quite slow. He constantly gets beat cabling the prices. And part of this is because he's having to manage a bunch of different arbitrage codes, and he's just not able to keep up. So one clerk in the system causes a big roadblock that is a huge problem for the firms to be able to actually participate in arbitrage effectively. The second one is that these two firms have no shared instinct, and they talk about this a lot. the London firm tends to sort of chase market prices around, whereas the New York firm believes in a very sort of scientific, small-grained, calculative approach to doing arbitrage. And it's not easy to set that up and to execute that similarly on both sides of the Atlantic. And then third, I mentioned this, arbitrageurs were always constrained to actually create the pricing equilibrium within a distributed network system when they were competing with other arbitrageurs that were operating on different sets of information from Berlin and Paris too. So it's difficult to sort of cordon off, say, how effective arbitrage was between New York and London when the politics of financial integration are creating a lot more complexity in the network. And then the final thing I'll say too is that arbitrage had politics, and it was especially the infrastructure of arbitrage had politics. In 1908, the London Stock Exchange banned stockbrokers from engaging in arbitrage with provincial stock exchanges. Now, the market makers of the London Stock Exchange, the jobbers, are still allowed to do this. But really, this was not a technical debate about the rules about who could or couldn't do arbitrage. It was a debate about who had access to and control of financial infrastructures. So one of the firms who is advocating for this change to prevent stockbrokers from participating in arbitrage says, the minority who have obtained private telephones and telegraphs, which their fellow members are unable to obtain, were asking the stock exchange to confer them in a monopoly which they created by breaking the rules. So basically what had happened is that large firms had obtained huge monopolies in terms of the labor power. They had better clerks, better messenger boys. They had better access to private telegraphs and telephones, and they were able to utilize this to push out smaller firms in the stock exchange and essentially break the rules. What was happening was stockbrokers who were supposed to just walk into the market and ask for a price were beginning to make prices like jobbers because they were facilitating arbitrage transaction and had lots of new information on new prices. So this was always a deeply politicized act within financial markets. So I'll just add with a few concluding thoughts. And again, I'm happy to talk in more depth about any of this in the Q&A. And it's about where I think this work should go and how it should change our approach to financial history. The first is that I think we need more fine-grained research into the construction of particular financial nodes. I focus on London in the paper and in this presentation because in the 19th century, it is the center of the financial universe. It had more power to change the system and to impose its will on other financial actors in this period than anyone else. But as I've tried to show, that power was always deeply constrained, right? It was one part of a larger network, and as powerful as London was, it still couldn't change the way the French government dealt with its telegraph. It couldn't change operations in other financial centers necessarily. The second is that I think we need to incorporate this kind of infrastructural criticism into quantitative event studies. Rather than just doing these abstract studies about the introduction of the telegraph that looks at volume of messages and closing prices, I think we can drill down more specifically. So what I used when I was reconstructing some of this is the Financial Times has street prices for a lot of this year, which actually, for a lot of this period, which looks at the fine-grained movements of securities that were arbitraged between New York and London, as opposed to just the closing prices, which is not really a good indication of what was happening. I also think we need to drill into the technical specificity of how arbitrage was conducted. Multiplex telegraphs that connected London and Paris were very different than the kind of simplex telegraphs that connected Liverpool and Berlin, let alone the other types of telegraphs that London used to connect with Amsterdam and Brussels. So arbitrage capability was not equally distributed. I already talked about, I think we also need to drill into the different labor systems that underpin these financial structures and have a more multinodal approach, really think about different financial markets' role in shaping the system. And then finally, really thinking about the ways that even though all of these people are profit-seeking and technology is often turned for profit-seeking motive, it is making arbitrage more effective in this period. It also has political implications within financial markets of how that efficiency is distributed, who gets to have access to it, and who gets to benefit from it, which is always a fundamentally political question. So thank you. That's my presentation.
Thank you, John, for this fascinating presentation. We have 2 questions already, so I'm going to first call Thomas Stingberg.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. First, it's an amazing presentation, but I want to raise a couple of questions. First, I've looked at these things, particularly in terms of commodity markets, like especially the silver market between Mumbai, and New York and London. Did you at all look at those aspects? Because there was very active, you could call it arbitraging anyway, attempting to take advantage of market intelligence on the part of transactors in Mumbai. Again, they had a much more tenuous connection with both telegrams and telephones going into the 20s and 30s. The other 2 things that obviously occur to me is you're obviously looking at essentially stock markets. You might also, I hope you can also see me, you might also look at the interaction between them and particular commodity markets, especially, as I say, silver and gold, bullion, etc. And I don't know if you read the new Beyond, you probably have the new Beyonza book, if that's how it's pronounced, on taking the floor on a contemporary Wall Street trading room. But many of the kinds of things you're talking about the if you will, the physical mechanics, etc., are dealt with him in this book. It's Princeton University Press book.
Yeah. So one, this project sort of in many ways emerges out of the economic sociology of Bunza and Donald Mackenzie. I sometimes pitch this as like Michael Lewis for the 19th century. So I have read that book, and that's really in some ways what I'm trying to get at with this historically. And then 2, I think your point about commodity markets is exactly right. Arbitrage in commodities in some ways was going on long before arbitrage in financial securities, right? I mean, we were talking about the Rothschilds before other people logged on, but they were the pros at this before the introduction of telecommunications. Personal information networks were very important to conducting of this. I haven't incorporated that into this work yet, but I think your point is spot on, right? That this is a broader structural thing that is changing all types of different financial markets, and thinking about the relationship between arbitrage in securities and arbitrage in commodities is a key aspect of that. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Now, Tyson Leuchter, please.
Hello, great, John. This is a fascinating project, and a great presentation. And I love all the details in this, the kind of material history. This particularly one of people complaining about like the kind of like the foot speed, the messengers, and how like the Americans have to haul ass all the way around to actually get there. It's a wonderful detail. I have 2 questions, 2 kind of nitpicky, annoying questions. One is the question of modernity, because you set off saying that this is, the first modern financial markets, and clearly there's something appears to be modern about it. But I want to push you on exactly how modern is it, and I wonder if your definition of infrastructure is in some intention with this sort of periodization of modernity, particularly because you're looking away at just not just standardized prices and sort of telegraphic cables, but in fact we have all these sorts of human, trust-mediated, informally mediated financial flows and so on. That looks very, very similar to previous centuries as well. I mean, almost all the sort of financial techniques go back centuries. There were jobbers and whatnot in the South Sea bubble and in the Mississippi bubble. And there was also a professionalized class of brokers. I mean, I know this mainly from the French case, but sort of infamously, the stockbrokers in France are the last company to be venalized right before the French Revolution, and they're reconstituted very soon thereafter as well. So, is this a kind of Weberian story of rationalization and whatnot? So what is specifically modern about this, especially if your main point is that what is modern is not technology, or at least not the fact of technology as well. So I want to push you on that. The other one thing I want to push you on is I'm fascinated by this politicization or the politics of arbitrage. I think it's really, really cool. But if I can be a little bit mean for a second, I think your definition of politics is rather thin on the ground right now. The politics of arbitrage is mainly competition for resources, is what it sounds like, access to resources. That sounds, to me, less like politics than the kind of economics of arbitrage. It's competition over scarce resources. So what exactly is the kind of definition of politics you're working at? But fascinating project, I really like it.
Thanks, those are good questions. And it's nice to finally meet you virtually. And I'm very curious to talk to you more about the relationship between London and Paris at some point. So the question of modernity, I have two answers to that. One is simply a scalar question, right? The 19th century sees this happen, sees the creation of formal financial markets on a scale that is fundamentally different than what's come before, right? There's something like 7 or 8, depending how you want to characterize it, formal stock exchanges around 1800, and there's something like 90 by 1900. This creates a different type of scale in the material infrastructure that are used to connect it, the labor, the professionalization. So even though these things do exist in some forms before, it's scaled up in such a way and has different transformations in the 19th century. So I think part of that, the modernity question, is just a question of scale. The second part of this, and I think you're right to point this out, is this just a Weberian story about bureaucratization and standardization? And I think it is more complicated in, there's been a lot of good recent work that has thought about the ways that new abstract standardized systems create new forms of personalization and the re-embedding of personal relationships. The 19th century does see this rise of a very specialized class of service workers, whether it's messenger boys, telegraphists, the porters that I talk about in a different chapter. Because of the new types of broad, abstract, standardized communication systems, this creates a new set of personalized laborers. So even though some of these things are familiar, they're getting recalibrated in different ways, and these standardizing processes create new forms of personal interaction. You have to have a new class of people that can facilitate these personal connections. The questions of the politics of arbitrage is a very good one. And I actually like, I might steal that from you. That it's really less the politics of arbitrage, and then rather than the deep economics of arbitrage, right? That is this battle for resources on the stock exchange floor. I'm not sure if I have anything better than that, but I take your point there that this is I need to work on unpacking that a little bit more. But I really like that perspective of the competition for resources and framing it as the sort of economic struggle for arbitrage as much as a political one.
Thank you. Mary Bridges.
Hi, thank you so much. I love this project, and I love your expansive view of infrastructure. And I wanted to, in particular, the point about the infrastructure being political. And I wanted to ask about like the claims for sort of superiority of one system over another, and your research kind of repeoples and rematerializes an infrastructure. And I was wondering about actors at the time. Like, it wouldn't have been any surprise to anyone that this infrastructure is made of human labor and messengers. So I'm wondering about, like, in different claims for the kind of superiority of one system over the other, is like, do you see the description of infrastructure getting depeopled and kind of like being described as superior over terms of efficiency to kind of erase some of the blockages and limitations that you're highlighting?
That's a good question. I actually tend to think that, at least for the contemporary commentators, infrastructure is very peopled for them. There are all these complaints, in fact, in the London Stock Exchange about the fact that arbitrage firms have created so much chaos because there are constantly messenger boys that are darting into the exchange. They have too many clerks, and that they are overpeopling the stock exchange is almost chalked up to the creation of arbitrage. There's also all these complaints that, you know, if you go down to the stock exchange, they barely speak English anymore. They're speaking French and German and all these other languages that aren't ours. So in a sense, I think that the de-peopling of the infrastructure is something that is a scholarly production rather than a contemporary one, because they were very aware of it, which is a good point to make when I'm discussing the historiography of this.
Thank you. Jita Patel.
Hi, sorry, I keep on turning off my video, but fascinating project. And I wanted to ask you a couple of questions because I, like Thomas Timberg, work on deep history and do much deeper history, perhaps. Just so to add to the other sort of thinking about arbitrage, I've been tracking, you know, the way in which, for example, factors, the salaries were arbitraged. You know, sort of, so if you think arbitrage in a much more expansive fashion, not just around commodities, exchange of goods, but really sort of if you people arbitrage in a different way, the British actually agreed to pay salaries, one amount, pay in one place, agreed to pay in one place and gave salaries in another. And so the idea of, you know, the differential value of currencies has been in place for a really, really long time. Right. So, but I think the thing so there's a couple of things. I mean, obviously your work ties in not just with the materialization of financial forms, but also the materialization of science. And there's tons of work done on it. Right. You know, you don't have Hooke's microscope without a lot of letters. Right. So I was wondering, so that's one question, because it is in some ways both an economics and an SDS project, right? So how would you actually connect this to the materialization, or let's say the defetishization of the abstract, to go back to Marx rather than a bunch of other folk? The other thing, I mean, just to think about, like, rationalization is a sort of form of imaginary, if you will, right? And you've used it as the sort of architecture against which you write. So I work on contemporary as well as early stuff, and it's partly to renegotiate the question of anachronisms, right? So Weber's I mean, Weber sort of might tie in some ways, it might not be quite anachronistic, but how do you, I mean, what's at stake in you, for you in a kind of anachronism? Now, what's really important is temporality. Do you do any work with the sort of setting up of time and the relationship of the telegraph in actually establishing universal time, right? And so, you know, because that's the infrastructure, that's the basis of the infrastructure you need. I have two quick questions. So I do stuff on physics. So it's like, it seems to me that you could do more with the idea of the electrical, right? The idea of the wave, to actually think a theoretical apparatus for what you're doing, which is both something that flows easily and then gets caught, right? So is there something that you can think with that actually comes from the materiality? I mean, you're trying to re-theorize using the materiality of technologies. Is there something you can think with through the materiality of the physics? And I'd say, I mean, what about law? If you're thinking infrastructure, to go back to Tyson's question, what happens to law, right? So you've gone to politics instead, and which is, you know, it's not politics qua politics in some simple way. And then trust, right? That's something in the chapter that you work out. It's really interesting to think about the materialization of trust and distrust, right? Because that's part of the whole, I mean, in some ways you're working with the materialization of it. So, you know, it'd be lovely if you spoke more explicitly to the establishment of trust and distrust over the whole sort of apportionment of your chapter.
Those are great questions, and I feel like I can't do them justice. The first thing I will say is that I think you're exactly right about the little bit of a straw man of economic rationality that I write against in this, and I'm trying to figure out a better way to do that. And so I like your idea of beginning to import some of the writing from the concepts that I'm actually working with, as opposed to against this thing that we mostly have debunked already. So I'm aware of that, and I'm trying to do better. So I really appreciate your thoughts on that. The second thing is that Paula actually said that I should self-promote my recently published article on the history of the ticker tape, which where I do get more into the nitty-gritty. This chapter is really the sort of macroscopic one, but I have a chapter on the material infrastructures of this. And one of the things I talk about is that when the ticker tape is first introduced to the London Stock Exchange, the nationalization of the telegraph means that the ticker tape company initially has to rent wires from the British Post Office. Those wires typically only work with 120 volt charges and only carry an average current of about 20 amperes. But a ticker tape, right, it's blasting out simultaneous messages in one direction. They use about 240 volts of electricity for each thing, and it creates an average amperage of about 35 per wire. So it just starts destroying postal wires throughout London. And so eventually the post office gives up trying to regulate them, says, go ahead, build your own thing, like do whatever, because it's materially destructive to the rest of the telegraphic system. And this goes as much too for some of the stuff I talk about here in the arbitrage chapter. Establishing multiplex telegraphy connections, which they wanted to do because the more multiplex systems you have, the higher volume of telegrams you can send. Is very difficult because a lot of the transatlantic wires, or even from Britain to Europe, they're laid under the sea. But if you have, say, simplex unidirectional wires that are not working on multiplex telegraphy, and then you switch one of those wires in an undersea cable to something that is working on a quadruplex multiplex telegraphy, you're going to throw off all of this interference. And so they didn't realize this at first, and they busted all these wires, and it's a real management problem. So one of the things I do try and emphasize in the work is the ways that the technical constraints of telegraphy, of physics, electromagnetism, throws up all of these problems that can't be overcome with some economic rationality or whatever, right? That's not, it's always constrained by these bits. And so I broadly take your point too, that I think that that's actually not just an empirical fact, but rather a way that I think you can begin to think through, conceptualize the system as a whole. So yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you. Atiba Persilia.
Hi, thanks so much for a really great talk. I was going to offer a comment and then a couple of questions. One is that I looked at the records for when the New York Stock Exchange was being built in 1903, and one of the questions that came up was about how to basically build. I think there were 2 or 3 different telegraph companies there, and there was a question of how to build their facilities within the exchange that they basically got messages at the same time from London or other exchanges. So I don't know if there are similar records you might find for the London Stock Exchange perhaps. But the questions I had, the first one was about, we're sort of following up on what Tyson Luchter mentioned about like the questions of modernity. And I was wondering, you went to discussing scale, and I'm wondering about how speed changes over time, and whether that is another part of how arbitrage develops, and also how scale changes in terms of the ways that brokers or jobbers are using financing. Like, are they developing new kinds of relationships with banks in order to be able to finance larger and larger, arbitrage maneuvers, or whatever the technical term is. And then my other question was kind of a different direction. I'm just curious to know if you've looked into what exactly deceit looks like when it comes to arbitrage, and whether that's deceit between two people who think they're on the same side of an arbitrage relationship, but it turns out they're not? Or how does the exchange develop mechanisms for judging what is gentlemanly or honorable ways of conducting arbitrage versus unethical or illegal?
Yeah, no, those are great questions. I will say the first one is I had a portion of it in here and I cut it for space, but I might put it back in. We tend to think of arbitrage especially, but really all of these financial transactions that occur via the telegraph as something that is necessitates speed and acceleration. But in the 19th century, and this is very reminiscent of what happened in GameStop, but in the 19th century, you still settling accounts takes much longer than execution on the floor. So execution can happen very quickly, but in the London Stock Exchange, they still have settlement every 2 weeks. So that's a process, and that's a process that is not automated until mid to late 20th century. This is clerks who have a pile of tickets that they have to go sift through and put in books and net out, and it takes quite a while, and it's a very slow process, which leads to a whole host of other complications when it comes to funding. One of the big things between New York and London is that New York does settlement overnight, whereas London has 14-day settlement. So London, it's very easy to finance positions. You don't really have to worry about it. But New York firms, it creates this entire shadow banking system of funding overnight positions that London firms are then sort of on the hook for if they haven't sort of successfully closed out their arbitrage book for the day. So that creates, so even though these transactions are speeding up, they're still actually really slowed down and limited by the forms of funding and settlement that happen. So I think that's a really helpful dynamic to play with. And I'm certainly going to put this back in the chapter per your question. The second one, I'm going to dodge the question a little bit. I've never found anything that was accusations of deceit in arbitrage within like the trying to whether or not it was gentlemanly or whatever within the London Stock Exchange. What I have found is that there was a conception that arbitrage itself was very unmanly, un-English way of performing finance. There's a great op-ed in the Financial Times in the 1890s that talks about how basically, this is like the as if it talks about like the caste system in India, and this is the arbitrage is the equivalent of just taking up the clippings of people's hair on the ground if you're a low caste person, and it's really not the way that real financiers make money. This is just scraps, it's penny pinching, and then they equate that to why so many Europeans and foreigners are coming to the exchange, and they're upending the English system. And so there is a lot of concerns around the gentlemanliness or the Englishness of arbitrage itself as a practice. So that's one of the things I've found particularly interesting.
Thank you. Manuel Batista.
Yes, thank you. So this is a fascinating project, John. I'm so happy to look at how someone took sort of all the literature that has been developed in the last 15 years in terms of economic sociology of financial knowledge and financial markets. So I have three sort of questions, and the first one is for a commissioned project. I looked at what happened with the New York Stock Exchange during World War I, and then Hurricane Sandy in 2012, and then of course 9/11. And so this leads me to a suggestion for you. So I know that World War I was the longest the New York Stock Exchange was closed. So I wonder what the closure or the days that the stock exchanges do not operate can tell you, and how it can inform your project. Because I think that, it's as important to understand how arbitrage operates in a daily, like regular day in the markets, but it's also important to understand, what if there is a national holiday in France? What if there is a national holiday in Berlin? What if the Queen of England dies? I'm just assuming, So how are these arbitrageurs reacting to all of this? Then the second question for you is IPOs. So we all know that the days of the biggest rises and spikes and volatility in prices, in the stock prices, usually coincide with the days they are listed. Now, my sense is that at the time, in the late 19th century, at least in the United States, most of these process takes place during book building. And so you don't really see that much of volatility as we're now used to, you know. So I'm wondering if there's anything that you can tell. I know better the case for the US. I don't really know anything about what's happening in the LSE. And then the third thing is to push a little bit into Tyson's direction into thinking what is truly different in your period. So to me, for example, I work with price currents, and I always like to think of price currents as the first Bloomberg terminals of the world, right? And then someone would probably go to Babylon and say, wait a minute, this tablet of clay was possibly the first Bloomberg terminal of the world, right? So in my case, I always think, well, telegraph accelerates messages and processes that used to take weeks and maybe days, and now we're talking about milliseconds. So that's just a way to think about your project in terms of not only about Britain and Imperial Britain, but rather, you know, how to make this a comparative case of interest to other financial historians working in other periods and locales. So thank you very much.
Great. Yeah, no, those, I don't have answers to your questions, but I think they're good. So by three provisional things, I would say, one, I completely agree on focusing on days when the exchanges close and these communications are frayed. I think that's like a great idea of actually sort of throwing into relief what's happening on busy days of arbitrage. So I think that's a brilliant idea that, you know, we should continue to push on. And especially like World War I and World War II are very interesting because they cut the cables for arbitrage. It's still open in some instances, it's not open in others. And so that creates a series of very unique pricing shocks that people are trying to respond to and often don't have the technical capacity to actually do it. The second one on IPOs is also very interesting. I found, this is anecdotal because so few records of arbitrage firms still exist. But in the couple that I have found, a lot of them were very involved in introducing IPOs, syndications to the London Stock Exchange. And this is precisely because they knew if they helped to do this, they were creating arbitrage markets for themselves. So a lot of it was dual listed companies that would be in, it was already on Paris and they helped bring it to London or something like that. And so arbitrageurs were very, I found that they tended to be involved in that. They weren't the main syndicalists, right? That was usually bigger firms, bigger banks, but they were often involved with this because they saw the opportunities for themselves. And then third, yeah, no, I take the point about I could make more about the particular speeding up of the 19th century, but also, you know, for the last question too, I think it's also important to note the ways that speed is always constrained and is slowed down by all these various operational restraints that it works under. So, but thank you. No, I think you're spot on with those questions.
Nadine Chambers.
Thank you to the organizers. Hi, John. Beaming in from England. First of all, thanks to the organizers for putting it a bit early. I've been in conferences at 4 a.m. lately at the West Coast, so much appreciated. I met John here in the UK, and I'm just so thrilled to see his work just bloom and develop. I've got two things. One, interestingly, I was at the AAG geography conference looking at digital labor last night, digital geographies. And so talking about smart cities, you know, these new ways and forms of work. So I really love that you're bringing the people into it in terms of those bits. Two reasons why. One is, before I pose my question, Paul Fife's work on electronic errata around the actual, like, you know, elements of who people were in terms of printing, actually, copy boys, etc. It's a beautiful article. Also work that's been done on the Hansard, the parliamentary papers, and the whole copyright of that, and you know, who got to control it, etc., and the kinds of notes and the personalities in the margins of the folks that were writing down things, right? This is just your whole project asks us to go back to look at people within these large systems, right, that have been kind of concrete, paved over in terms of these larger bits. But I'm thinking about Dr. Patel's question to you about law, mostly because I do legal geography, and you're looking at geographies, right, of arbitrage. So I'm coming to you this way. Two things. One, thinking about Dan Burke, who does work on law and the digital and copyright, and how it, like, law can't actually keep up with this thing traveling super fast, as well as Bernard Keenan, who's at Birkbeck, where I am, looking at how, the criminal justice system can't keep up either with, like, forms of crime, digital, like, there's a bunch of different ways. So I would ask, because I kind of glossed through your paper because it doesn't, look to law, but whether or not the question that Dr. Patel has asked you might be something that you're thinking of, because things are speeding so fast, even things like trust, right? Trust, law, what we believe is moral, these are all spinning, in wildly different cultural ways here. It might be you have a whole other project on your hands. So, don't feel pressured around this chapter and the dissertation, which I can't wait to see it. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. It's so great to see you. It's been a while. And ironically enough, I was a research assistant for Paul Feist way back when I was an undergraduate. So I know him very well.
Beautiful person.
And I've been in this mode. I'm particularly inspired too by Katie Hinmarch-Watson's work on telegraphists and telegraph boys. She just has a new book out called Serving a Wired World, which I think it's been really informative for my approach here. As to law, it's a good question. I don't really address it basically in the dissertation at all. And there's two reasons for that. One, the London Stock Exchange itself really works very hard to keep the law outside of it. Occasionally, of course, they end up in fraud cases and stuff goes to court, but they really do everything they can to keep all of their governance in-house. I think this is broadly true in other financial markets. I would love to be corrected on people who would know more than this about me. And then the second bit, right, is just the really almost non-existence of something like standardized international law before World War I. And then you get World War I, you get World War II, and you get concretizing of national borders. You get the establishment of big international organizations that try and legally arbitrate things in a more standardized way. You don't really have that in the 19th century. You have an assortment of different bodies that try and launch various legal things about financial discrepancies. Other people here know more about this than me, but bondholder committees that launch lawsuits about certain things, or the non-standardization of share certificates that move between different national geographies. Those are things that are sort of just dealt with ad hoc as they come up. So I think the reason law has never come up for me really is because it's just so patchwork and not particularly systematized when it comes to global finance in the 19th century, which is, I think, more of a 20th century story. But it's something I should pay more attention to for sure, because it's still there in shaping it in a variety of ways.
Perfect. So we have 5 minutes left, and we have a question by Sebastian. John, perhaps before you answer Sebastian's question, I can also pose you one of my own, and then you answer, okay? Sebastian, thank you.
Okay. Hi, John. Thank you. Great presentation. I love your work. I will read it. So as you know, the concept of arbitrage has been largely used, I would say, by economists doing economic history. And one of the uses they have given to this concept is to look for market integration, or to analyze market integration, not only financial markets, but commodity markets, labor markets, as people mentioned before. So, and I really like the way you complicated kind of this theoretical assumption in the way arbitrage work in the financial markets. And because of that, I was wondering to what extent does this complication, the real working of this system, all the challenges it poses for people doing this in the financial markets, change that approach, the approach that economists use when looking for market integration? That's my question.
Thank you, Sebastian. So, John, my question is actually, I actually have 2 or 3, but you can choose whatever you want to answer. So the first one, which I think might be the most interesting, is whether there's a competition for access or there's uneven access to infrastructure within the London Stock Exchange, further the segmentation of markets within the LSE, and perhaps even increase cohesion in specific markets. For example, I was thinking whether, besides competing, brokers and jobbers in the American market within the LSE would also come together, overcome challenges of collective action to just ask for better access to telegraphs, for example. The second question is whether arbitrage was not only for profit, but also for propping up specific securities between London and New York. And I was thinking if government bonds would also be part of this strategy. And last of all, it's just a thought, because you were talking about service workers and this new service industry, is whether these arbitrageurs, they created a new demand for accountants to just, look for the books and try to make sense of the mass of, or the varieties of calculative technologies. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Those are all really good questions. I'll start with Sebastian, because your question is in some ways the fundamental question of this whole chapter and my whole project, right? Like I say in the conclusion, like, how much does this actually change? Market integration happens. Who cares how it happens, right? There's a really good, it's Barry Eichengreen and a few other folks, I forget their name, I cite at the end of the paper, and they look at the way FX markets develop in relation to high-speed internet cables. And they show that, right, broadly speaking, in the abstract, FX markets become more efficient because of high-speed internet, but they become more efficient in particular places. London and Singapore, that are these oceanic connections that have the meeting of a bunch of different cables, gain the most benefits of this. And we've seen even with Brexit, London is slowly losing a lot of FX market share, but it had built up such a huge lead, right? And so it does matter, I think, to be able to tell stories, not just in market integration, but who market integration serves, who is benefiting from it, and who is getting to set the rules of how it happens. And so I really think that I'm trying to, and this is as much a call for partners and collaborators as anything else, is that we need more quantitative event studies that think about how these different infrastructures shape the ways markets develop, and really honing in on both the infrastructures and a broader quantitative story. Paula had a bunch of questions. I'm trying to remember. Accountants, market segmentation within the London Stock Exchange itself, and what was your other one?
Is whether arbitrage was also used to prop up securities.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and in government bonds and stuff, right? Okay.
Yes.
The question about segmentation and integration within certain markets of London itself is a great one. I actually really haven't thought of that, but that would be a terrific project. The only thing I will say is that it does reshape the physical geography of markets. As the London Stock Exchange builds in more telegraph offices, they constantly are rearranging where they place the physical markets that the things are traded in, so that they are closer to certain telegraphic offices. And this, again, creates certain advantages for some and disadvantages for other. What had been the previously largest market in London, which was for English government debt, they get shunted to this very small corner of the exchange because all the other ones that do a lot of arbitrage business and telegraph business get the prime placement, and they're furious about this. They constantly write letters, petitions, and it's a whole thing. So I think that's a really interesting and a fruitful path of inquiry. Accountants, yes. Arbitrage firms actually recruit clerks specifically from accounting houses and actuaries and insurance companies because they're more mathematically literate than a lot of the other lower end clerks that you might just find in the city of London that do things like checking bargains and settling accounts at the end of the day. And then the third one was propping up. I've not found a lot of evidence of this, but that's not to say it didn't happen. The problem, I think, would be that that's a lot of international coordination. That's very expensive and would require a lot of manpower to do. So I'm not sure the extent to which it happened. I can't imagine it was a particularly frequent thing, but again, that's not to say it didn't exist.
Thank you so much, John. We would also like to thank you all for attending this great session, and we would also like to welcome you for our next session on May the 17th for the paper, The Local Dimension of Global Finance, Eastern Europe, Latin America, and the Global Debt Crisis of the 1980s by Lucas Dovern and Matthew Nestler. Thank you so much. All your questions on chat will be passed along to John. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you, everyone. That was really great.